Thanks for having me today. Really appreciate it. I'm here to talk to you all about pricing and packaging on the enterprise side, giving you a perspective of what is it like inside of a large enterprise for areas like budgeting and procurement, how that's affected by COVID-19, and how you can respond by potentially rethinking or reallocating some of your investments about pricing and packaging. In terms of background, right now I'm a VP at a large enterprise called CWT. The area isn't particularly relevant to this presentation, but it happens to be in business travel. I'm in the technology area of that, leading a pretty large size group around DevOps platforms and products. Before that, I was at 451 Research, leading an analyst team around kind of the full-scale software lifecycle, and prior to that, I was at RedMonk. My background before that is in a combination of software engineering leadership, and data science as an actual scientist doing drug discovery before we had data science as a term. So hopefully that sets some of the ground for what I'm bringing to the table for this discussion, which is really a combination of understanding things from an analyst perspective on the market, thinking about pricing, packaging, positioning, as well as understanding what it looks like inside of a large, fairly traditional enterprise and being able to share some of that context with you. So here are the goals for what I would love all of you who are watching this either live or on recording to be able to do at the conclusion of our time today. Understanding how enterprise budgeting works, what that process looks like, and specifically with the context of thinking, how do you engage with that? How do you target your message and your timing to work really well with those kinds of budget cycles? Being able to explain to co-founders, to your sales team, what enterprise spend approval and procurement look like so they understand how to engage effectively with that. And then thinking about especially what's going on right now with COVID-19, how that's changed budgets, how that's changed procurement cycles, how that's changed investments and decision-making. And then being able to apply all of those things to thinking about how and when do you engage with prospects? Which prospects do you engage with? How much do you invest in bottom up compared to top down? When to think about partnerships and relationships and other areas where you might be able to apply these kinds of knowledge. Here I'm just resharing the homework we provided again, just to make sure that everybody has a sense of what we're talking about here. I wanted to provide a little bit more context on each one of these things. So the first one is a piece I wrote up a number of years ago now, but it's eternal. So don't take the 2012 date as something that means it's outdated. That just means it's an evergreen. This one really walks through when I'm using words like packaging. Not everybody's familiar with that. And so what does that mean in the context of how I think about software and technology as a whole? The second one is a really good recent post from Andreessen Horowitz talking through what kinds of things you can do right now, whether you're a SaaS business or another business. A lot of it's pretty generic. In areas of where do you focus, where do you remove emphasis, where do you invest more? One of the areas that I'm going to focus on today especially is the bottom-up adoption aspect of that. Many of you are doing this already, so it's nothing new conceptually. There's a lot of the specifics that I want to make sure that you're asking the right questions of, do you have good adoption paths, that sort of thing. The third one is from the SaaStr Summit from about a month ago. This is a really nice talk. It's about a 30-minute video or so talking through both from Salesforce Ventures, looking at our portfolio, as well as Salesforce, the company itself, talking about how they're modifying their go-to-market and how their portfolio companies were modifying their go-to-market strategies, where they're investing in sales, where they're not. And then the final one I shared, you might be wondering, how is this relevant? This one I think is really valuable when you're working with large enterprises to convince them that they can do this, right? If the Department of Defense can do these things, can get out of its waterfall purchasing and budgeting and procurement, then they can too. And so this can be not just good for you, but a good toolkit to be able to share with some of the people you're working with inside of enterprises to think about how they can use it to evangelize different approaches. So what we're going to walk through to get to those goals we just covered is talk through what does budgeting tend to look like inside of an enterprise? How does that work? What's the timing look like? What kinds of things are happening there? what does buying look like? You see a few of those touch points, but there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that you might not engage with as much. If you're newer to some enterprises, especially more typical middle of the road kinds of enterprises, you might not have seen some of these behaviors before, and so some of them might be new to you. The third thing we're going to talk through is what's going on with COVID-19, some of the changes that's happened. I'm going to pull in some survey data that 451 Research in particular has done some nice flash surveys over the past month to look at what enterprises are doing at pretty large scale. And then finally, what are some of the things that you can do to adapt to both the normal budgeting and buying habits as well as the changes that have happened most recently. So we're going to spend a few minutes walking through this slide. I'm not going to read it word for word for you, but I am going to talk through what a typical cycle might look like. So this is what an enterprise budgeting process might look like. What I want you to take careful note of here is that it's nearly a full calendar year from the point at which people begin thinking about the initiatives they want to invest in to the point at which they're able to make a successful purchase. Now, a lot of this can be very timing dependent of exactly when you engage and exactly how you engage. And for example, whether there's already been budget created to solve a particular problem, they just don't know that you're the solution yet, or whether you're going in and trying to pitch them on a brand new problem that they haven't thought about before. And each one of those things can create some different kinds of challenges and opportunities for you. So if you think about what this might look like, right now, as a matter of fact, it's May. And so they're already beginning budget planning for next year. So if you haven't started talking to people at some of your prospects, you might already be too late, as a matter of fact, because you don't have those relationships in place. And so if you're trying to go after some of these areas, you got to really back up and slow down. This is why, you hear a lot of anecdotes about, hey, an enterprise buying cycle might take 18 months. That's because of how do you get engaged early enough to get into people's budgets for the next fiscal year? That's the big challenge, right? If you thought right now you would have had to have a relationship in place prior to COVID-19 even becoming a thing to become a brand new line item in next year's budget. And a lot of this is going to change with COVID-19. I'm not going to get into a ton of details on that right now because that's changed a lot of current actions, and that's created a lot of uncertainty around what future budgets are going to look like. But if you start walking through this, you think, all right, right now, people may be beginning to plan their budgets now that they've gotten through a lot of the worst of the initial response to COVID-19. They now have quickly moved everybody to work from home, figured out what kinds of cost actions they might be taking through the next few months, maybe through the end of this year. It depends on when their fiscal year ends. And start thinking through if next year is back mostly to normal, they're going to be thinking through probably a few different scenarios of, and next year is fully back to normal. Maybe next year is back to 75% or 90% of normal. And maybe next year continues to be really rough. And they're probably going to be working out some budget scenarios for each one of those possibilities. They're going to send out all kinds of probably spreadsheets, probably Excel, because people in finance tend to really love working in Excel to this day. A lot of those in enterprises are using very traditional tools. They're not using any of the modern SaaS things that you might see if we're using more agile budgeting approaches, like, for example, Uber's open source some of their own stuff. They're not using any of that. No, they're using Excel. They're using it on Windows because this is what enterprises do. And so they're emailing around all these Excel sheets. People are trying to manage 1,500 different versions. There's new formats going out. It's really a big cluster. And that's part of what makes this take so long is the processes just aren't good. And so where you want to care about this is when you make it lost. When you thought there was going to be a line item created, you got to chase that through with your partner inside of that enterprise all the way and make sure that your line continues to exist. Understand how much budget might be getting created for you. Understand, is that changing? Provide any ammunition you can around a strong business case for what's happening. Because a lot of these enterprises are going to be coming up with 5 times more things they would love to do than they're going to have money to spend them on. And that multiple might be getting even higher than usual right now because they're going to have potential lower budget scenarios for next year. And so you got to figure out, how do you help your champion or your buyer create a really strong business case, because it's going to be fighting them out with every single other thing. There's going to be nothing on that list that people are doing because it's cool to do, or because it seems like it would be interesting. Every single thing that gets approved is probably going to be creates new revenue, cuts real costs in hard dollars, right? This can't be any more of those business value spreadsheets that you're trying to put together, or calculators that you're trying to put together that create soft value. Soft value is not going to fly right now. It's got to be hard dollars that they can take to the bank. It can't be, oh, we freed up some time for your people so they can focus on other stuff. That's not going to be a great sell right now. It's got to be, how are you going to create money? How are you going to create cash flow for people? And so as they're working through that, they're collecting all these high-level costs. They're collecting high-level business cases. They're making some initial submissions, maybe by midsummer. And then a lot of the politics really get going in earnest. And this is, again, where you have to be able to reinforce your champions and executives and buyers with everything they need to know to be able to provide a really strong defense for your product, your service, staying in budget. If you don't provide that kind of ammunition, they're going to have a really hard time defending themselves, and it can easily get slashed. Finally, toward the end of the year, there's probably some kind of a board of directors meeting for the company. Either the CEO will approve the budget or the directors will approve the budget. And that timing can vary a little bit. In some cases, it's toward the end of a quarter. In some cases, it's toward the beginning of a quarter. It's a good thing to have an understanding of, because that budget for the next fiscal year isn't going to be real until the board approves it. And so a lot of companies are going to not start acting on approving spend into the next fiscal year until there's a final signed off budget, which turns out can cause a lot of problems in terms of slowing things down for you into the next year. And so you start looking, the next fiscal year starts January-ish. And even though there was already budgeted money for this thing, it may still not actually be approved to be spent. There might be a separate proposal that has to happen to spend the money that was already budgeted. And this is where things start getting a lot more detailed, right? There's not just a high level justification of, hey, here's a problem. Here's a couple of different vendors we might use. This is where it starts getting real. There has to be a solid business case. There might be detailed estimates of spend internally, externally, professional services, licensing, all that kinds of stuff, because they're going to have that so they understand how to treat the financials. What's the cash flow going to look like? Is it going to be CapEx? Is it going to be OpEx? Is it going to be on-prem or not? Is it attached to existing assets? All that kind of stuff that finance has to do. There's going to be all these security reviews. You might find that if you don't have some of the certifications around things like PCI, or depending on the kinds of data you store, that there's going to be super detailed security questionnaires that are going to be a huge time sink and pain in the rear. This is where you start thinking, especially right now, how do you get more scalability? And it might be that certifications are a path that you want to look at, because you don't want to sit there on every single one-off prospect answering 155 different security questions. You want to say, hey, I've got the stamp, now let's move on, right? I've got my SOC 2 Type 2, I've got my PCI, I've got my HIPAA, I've got whatever other thing you need to care about. You just say, hey, we're good to go. Let's do it. There's also all kinds of other reviews, architecture, operability, financials, you name it. There's probably somebody reviewing it when they're trying to prepare to make the spend happen. And that might take a month, that might even take 2 months of back and forth. And then finally you get to a position where you can know that the purchase is going to happen. And I say no in air quotes. It might still fail, but it's all approved, ready to go. The only thing you have to do is get through the negotiation with procurement and legal. And we'll talk through a little bit of that next. But this should give you a good sense of what those timelines can look like, and they're really extended. Now, if you walk through an example of an individual thing getting bought, right? So one of those proposals to fund and purchase a thing, here's an example of some of the steps that might be involved. First, you got to get into the running. You got to get your solution somehow picked. That might be a formal request for proposals, request for information, or what have you, especially if it's being run by procurement or if it's over some kind of threshold, right? That might be $250K, $500K, $1 million. Every company is a little bit different on what their thresholds look like and what level of process they require at different kinds of thresholds. So there might be something formal. There might be a bake-off. You might have to go on site and do some kind of a proof of concept where you're testing it against other solutions for can it work. And if you're not in the running here, you've already lost the deal. And so how do you maintain enough visibility and awareness early on so that you even get into that initial competition? So that's question one. Some of that can be bottom up, some of that can be top down. It always depends on the individual company of how and when are they engaging their technical leadership in some of these initial decisions. In some cases, you can even get in late. It varies, right? So there was an example I was working with last year where, there were 3 finalists and you could squeak another one in if it was highly relevant, right? It's like a rolling admissions here. There's not like a cutoff where you say, oh, hey, you're done now. But you do have to have that strong case so that you can help communicate that to your champion to get into the running. So, there might be a tech vendor selection. After that, there's this whole proposal I was talking about, all kinds of, project managers, program management, tech lead, finance, executives, all kinds of people getting involved in trying to put this proposal together. And that will happen at traditional companies. That'll also even happen at more modern ones. You think about, for example, the kinds of write-ups you hear about happening inside of Amazon, the 2-pager, the 6-pagers. That's that, really. It just has a different level of structure and formality around it. Tons of different people are looking at this stuff in matrix managed companies or in companies where there's a lot of cross-functional dependencies, which is to say basically every enterprise that's been around for a while. There's a ton of different people who have to look at stuff to make sure things don't get missed. And so, you might have people coming in and saying, oh, well, hey, you have to budget for monitoring for this new thing you want to have. You have to budget for the servers, you have to budget for the network, you have to budget for the security reviews, all these other things that have to get included in these proposals so that people get the finances right. Finally, that review works its way through. Then comes the part that you see. All right, so you might have literally seen almost none of the things that happened before that. But what do you see? You see when procurement reaches out to you to start telling you to lower your price and knock off 10%. I'm sure you can do another 10,000 or 50,000 off or whatever it might be. And you see when legal reaches out. And of these two, I will say that I have seen more deals fail because of legal than almost anything else. If you can't come to terms on some of the legal things they're looking to, there are always companies, trying to see how far they can push you. But you have to really think about some of those legal interactions to see if they're going to be a deal killer. Of if you can't get an MSA in place, that, for example, can delay closing by months just to get that done, because people are going back and forth about indemnity and pricing and all this other stuff that legal teams want to create some value for their own companies around. The procurement piece is a little bit easier because that is more of a simpler discussion, right? Controversial to be sure, because you're talking about dollars here, but there aren't that many different pieces of it to talk about. All right, there's how much am I paying you, when and how am I paying you, and that's a lot of what there is to it. Whereas the legal part is indemnity, it's risk, it's software audits if you have some kind of an on-prem offer or anything like that. And there's a lot of different gaps to fall through there. And then finally, deal closes, which hopefully you see. The one thing I would say on this with enterprises is, especially right now, they might be moving pretty slow on paying you. And so you might have to chase that payment pretty hard. In some cases, they might intentionally decide not to pay people who don't go chasing after them. So make sure you get that check. Just like fundraising, you don't have the money until it's in the bank. So now a couple things I want to show you thinking about what's going on due to COVID-19 right now. Here's a survey 451 Research ran. Like I said, I used to work for them. They do some really nice surveys. This one is linked, and you can actually find it for free right now. They published a lot of their resources around coronavirus. And so if you look at some of the things enterprises are doing, what are they delaying? It tends to be around growth and around progress. So they're doing things a lot slower than they were. Doesn't mean they're doing nothing, which is the next piece I want to show you. But it does mean that they're not growing in the same way they used to. And so what are they doing? And I thought this was a pretty nice view to look at it. I'm not going to walk through it in detail, but what you can see initially is that many of the places they're investing are not surprising because they're things they have to do to be productive working remotely, right? It's collaboration, it's securing the collaboration, it's the tools for the collaboration, it's the devices for the collaboration, it's the network for the collaboration. You know, it's all those sorts of things to be able to be productive at all. And so then the question for you is, do you have a story that ties into any of those things? And if you do, then you might be able to get access to some of that budget where they're taking their money from over here and shifting it over here to say, we've got to do this to be productive right now, or we've got to do this to have a good business model right now if they're an e-commerce company, for example, or if they're a brick and mortar company that needs e-commerce real quick, you better figure out a way to make sure you're tying into the e-commerce story and not the brick and mortar story. But the piece that I do want to call out too is, even if you look farther down at the external or cloud IT infrastructure and internal IT infrastructure, there is still stuff happening there. There are still plans to spend there. And a lot of that is going to be to support some of the other areas of growth. And so what kinds of things can you do to adapt? And so I'm going to talk through a couple of different angles on this. One is what's going on from the perspective of buyer behavior. What are enterprises doing? They are extremely focused on cash flow, right? Especially through the end of this fiscal year, they're trying to figure out, how can I hold on to my dollars right now? And so that's going to make you want to think, how can you get a deal done while enabling them to keep as much cash in their pocket as possible through the end of their fiscal year? There's a lot of different creative ways you can try and structure a deal to do that. We'll talk through some of those right now, and we'll talk through some more of those in the in-depth discussion later on. Secondly, they're making extremely focused investments. They're not investing nearly as broadly as they were and trying to solve a large number of different problems. They probably no longer have 7, 8, or 9, or 10 different strategic priorities. They probably have 1 or 2 or maybe 3. And so they've really slimmed down their investments dramatically. They're focused on some of those areas you saw previously around, can we be productive right now? Do we have viable business models right now? And not a whole lot other than that. And finally, they are trying to lower their risk. They've taken a ton of risks due to the current economic environment. And so they're going to be focused on trying to lower risk in other ways they can. One of those ways is working with trusted partners. And so a lot of companies I've been talking with are trying to stick only to vendors and to relationships they've already built, whether that's software vendors or whether that's some opportunities for you to, of how could you take advantage of relationships that already exist with some of the prospects you're trying to target. Is that other vendor partnerships? Is that complementary offers? Is that resellers? Is that SIs? You got to be thinking about a bunch of different paths you could take to get in through a trusted partner that already exists. And if you think about your financials, you know, there's a lot of similarities in the problems you're trying to solve and the problems they're trying to solve, right? You're also focused on cash flow. This is one that can be a little bit at odds, unfortunately. And so there's not a great, it's kind of a zero-sum game, if you want to think about it that way, right? They want to hold on to their cash, you want to hold on to your cash. And so you're just going to have to figure out who's in the stronger cash position. How badly do you want to make a sale right now versus come back to them next fiscal year? Second piece, focused investment on your part. You know, we've heard already in the discussion before this talk, how do you decrease the number of different ways you're trying to get in and really focus on the ones that make a difference? And finally, you know, how can you lower your customer acquisition cost? And this is where we're going to talk through some different ways of how can you decrease the non-scalable aspects of that, and how can you really increase the places that are more scalable models. So if you look through a few ways we're going to focus on here, there are many other ways as well, and we can get into those during the discussion. But a few I want to mention are really doubling down on bottom-up adoption, ensuring that you invest very selectively in places that are not scalable, and rethinking the way you structure your deals and rethinking the way you consider where and how and when you should partner. So if we look at bottom-up adoption, one of the big things I always like to push on right now is you might be decreasing the size of your sales force. You might be decreasing your marketing spend right now, you have to think about what are the things you can do that are going to be really scalable, where you can create something once and you get people finding it on the internet, they come in, how do you go to where they are with resources you create once versus having to do everything as a one-off of, hey, you've got your external sales force and they're engaging one-off with this prospect and this prospect and this prospect. It's a way that'll get a deal done, but you probably don't want to focus on that approach right now. Second, and nothing new here, how do you build bottom-up adoption? A lot of this is around, do you have a community out there? Can you be investing in your community so that you can take advantage of some of those network effects and have other people do the work for you? Do you have an open source offering? If you don't, totally fine. Do you have a freemium offering? You might not, you might. If you don't have a freemium offering, I think Atlassian is always a good model to build off of here. It may not be freemium, but a lot of teams can figure out a way to come up with $10 a month. So do you have a way to get in the door at your target customer that they can expense, or that individual people at that customer might literally just decide to suck it up and not even bother expensing it on their corporate credit card? How can you get in the door to start building some of those relationships and become a trusted partner through a bottom-up path, so that by the time you're trying to do an enterprise-wide deal, you're already trusted and you don't have to try and build that from scratch right now. And third, and this is one where I see a lot of companies falling over, is you've got bottom-up adoption, but you don't have bottom-up revenue models. And so you really want to think about, is there a way you have for people to show up at your website and pay you money? Or can they only show up at your website, download your stuff, do a free trial, use some open source thing, but then they have to engage with a salesperson to be able to make a deal happen? If you're scaling down sales right now, you really want to be able to figure out a way to make sure you're able to get some revenue coming in the door through people's credit cards on your website. And then selective investment. This is one where I pulled this directly from that A16Z post. I thought it was really solid. The best revenue is from retention. It's much easier to retain your existing customers, and that's where you should invest your efforts versus get a new one. If you're trying to think about like a one-for-one trade, if you lost one customer, you gained one customer, how much effort could you have invested to keep the one you lost compared to how much you had to put in to get the new one? And think about that approach. So anything you invest in retention is going to be a great way to spend your time and effort right now. If you've got salespeople and they're not able to close deals, make them customer success managers instead. Put them on your best clients or your highest risk clients and figure out what can you do to make them happy right now. What can you do to keep them on board? How can you engage with them more deeply to keep things in a healthy place? Because even if they seem good right now, they could turn around at the drop of a hat and start pulling out force majeure or something else from their contract to try and dump the deal mid-year. Second, make investments in healthy opportunities. Sounds kind of like a platitude, I know, but think about where can you focus extremely selectively, whether that's industry specific of, like, for example, right now, I might not be thinking, hey, can I do a bunch of deals in travel and hospitality? I might be thinking, can I go out and engage with government, with defense, with insurance, with healthcare, with companies where things are still going reasonably well right now? Or even within larger conglomerates or larger companies, there might be opportunities at a departmental level where things are going well to get in there, even if the overall company or the overall industry isn't doing that great. And third, the blast marketing, the really broad spreads are not working that well right now because such a small percentage of people are able to take advantage of them. When there's so many different companies out there that aren't buying that much, you don't get nearly as much bang for the buck out of investing on reaching all of them compared to really trying to focus in on industries, geographies, or individual companies. It's an interesting time to think about, should you pivot some of that marketing into account-based marketing or something like that if you have companies you think have a 90% or higher probability of closing a deal, but they're just not moving that fast. And finally, deals and partnerships. Can you restructure the cash flow on the deal to try and push your customers spend into their next fiscal year? Do you know when their fiscal year ends? Right? It's not always calendar year. It might be in the middle of the year. It might be March. It might be the end of January. Companies have all kinds of wacky end times for their fiscal years. Can you figure out a way to push spend past December, for example, right now, or to build in some kind of an escalator on the contract so that, you know, year one is X, year two is X times 2, year 3 is X times 3. Some kind of a growth rate that's a base part of that contract. That's what I'm talking about when I say building growth, not just your annual 5% increase, but a multiple where you expect that their adoption is going to grow over time. And I was just hearing, I believe it was from the CEO of Slack, where he was talking about how they were focusing everything they could to avoid losing customers. Even if they said, hey, we'll drop you down to a cheaper plan, we'll give you a few months free, whatever it takes, hold on to that customer and try and push spend into the next year. And then finally, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, which is how can you build relationships that get you in the door? This is going to be more important now than it typically is, whether that's relationships with your favorite VAR, whether that's relationships with partners, with SIs, whatever it takes to try and get in there. Some of those are going to be easier than others. Sometimes it can be easier to just get a SKU at you know, an Insight or some other VAR versus trying to get some kind of a partnership with TCS. So that really wraps up that high level view on what I wanted to cover today. Talking through enterprise budget cycles, enterprise procurement, some data around how enterprises are responding to COVID-19, and some high level views on what you can do to adapt to that. And with that, I think we can wrap up the formal part of this session here